Chicago rises from the shores of Lake Michigan like a monument to human resilience, its steel and glass towers reaching toward the sky as testament to a city that has burned down and rebuilt itself more than once. This is the city of broad shoulders, where the wind howls between skyscrapers with the voice of the prairie, and where the memory of the Great Fire of 1871 still smolders in the collective consciousness of every resident. It is a city that knows fire intimately, respects it completely, and has bred generations of men and women willing to walk into the flames when others run away. But even Chicago, with all its experience with disaster and renewal, had never witnessed anything quite like what happened on the bitter cold night of January 17, 2014, when Captain Michael Mick O'Sullivan of Engine Company 18 vanished without a trace in a warehouse fire on the south side. 10 years later, the discovery of his helmet in the rubble of a completely different building would unravel a mystery so profound that it would challenge everything we thought we knew about the nature of time, sacrifice, and the invisible threads that connect past and present in the city of big shoulders. Michael O'Sullivan was exactly the kind of firefighter that Chicago legends are made of, a fourth-generation member of the Chicago Fire Department, whose family history read like a chronology of the city's most dramatic moments. His great-grandfather had fought the fires that followed the 1893 World's Fair. His grandfather had been there during the Our Lady of the Angels school fire in 1958, and his father had served with distinction during the turbulent 1960s, when the city burned with both literal flames and social unrest. At 38, Mick carried that legacy with a mixture of pride and humility that made him beloved by his crew and respected throughout the CFD. He was known for his encyclopedic knowledge of Chicago's fire history, his uncanny ability to read the behavior of flames, and most importantly, his unwavering commitment to the firefighter's creed. Everyone goes home, standing 6'2" with the weathered hands of someone who had spent 20 years pulling people from burning buildings. Mick was a Southside Irish Catholic who lived and breathed the neighborhood culture that had shaped him. He had grown up in Beverly, gone to Brother Rice High School, and married his high school sweetheart, Katie Murphy, in a ceremony at St. Cajetan Church that drew half the fire department. Their two children, Sean and Bridget, were 15 and 13 when their father disappeared, old enough to understand the dangerous nature of his work, but still young enough to believe that Mick O'Sullivan was invincible. Mick's specialty was structural firefighting in older buildings, particularly the century-old warehouses and industrial structures that dotted Chicago's south and west sides. He had an almost supernatural ability to read the stress patterns in burning timber and steel, often predicting structural collapses minutes before they occurred. His fellow firefighters credited him with saving dozens of lives over his career, including several dramatic rescues that had made him something of a local hero. But Mick was uncomfortable with the attention, preferring to focus on the technical aspects of firefighting and the continuous training that kept his crew sharp and safe. Engine Company 18, stationed in the Pilsen neighborhood, was one of the busiest in the city, responding to everything from kitchen fires in the Latino family's apartments to major industrial blazes in the warehouses that served Chicago's massive shipping and logistics industry. Mick's crew was known for their professionalism and their willingness to take on the most dangerous assignments. Lieutenant Tony Rodriguez, firefighter Jimmy Walsh, and firefighter-paramedic Maria Santos had worked together for 8 years, developing the kind of wordless communication and absolute trust that allowed them to operate effectively in conditions where visibility was zero, and every decision could mean life or death. The call that would change everything came in at 11:47 p.m. on January 17, 2014. A massive fire had erupted in a 6-story brick warehouse at 18th and Halsted, a building that had been scheduled for demolition, but was still being used for storage by several small businesses. The initial report suggested that homeless individuals might have been squatting in the building, and there were unconfirmed reports of people trapped on the upper floors. Engine 18 was first on scene, followed quickly by Ladder 9, Engine 21, and eventually half a dozen other units as the fire grew beyond what a single company could handle. Mick's approach to the warehouse fire was characteristically methodical. He spent precious minutes walking the perimeter of the building, studying the smoke patterns and the way the flames were consuming the structure. What he saw troubled him deeply. The fire was burning in patterns that didn't match any of his training or experience. Instead of following the natural paths that fires typically take through buildings, following air currents, consuming the most combustible materials first, spreading in predictable directions, this blaze seemed to be burning according to some other logic entirely. The warehouse, built in 1924, should have burned in a way that Mick could read like a book. The old timber frame construction, the stored materials, the layout of the floors and the ventilation systems, all of these factors should have created a fire that behaved according to well-understood principles. But as Mick studied the building, he realized that the flames were burning in places where there shouldn't have been sufficient fuel, avoiding areas that should have been consumed immediately, and creating heat patterns that seemed to defy the laws of thermodynamics. Despite his concerns about the unusual fire behavior, Mick made the decision to lead his crew into the building when reports came that civilians were definitely trapped on the 4th floor. The entry was made through the main entrance on Halsted Street, with Engine 18 following standard protocols for a high-rise structure fire. They had breathing apparatus rated for 45 minutes, full protective gear, and thermal imaging cameras that would allow them to navigate through the smoke and locate any trapped individuals. The last radio transmission from Mick came at 12:23 a.m., approximately 36 minutes after Engine 18 had entered the building. His voice, recorded by the CFD dispatch center, sounded calm but puzzled as he reported, "Engine 18 to command, we've reached the 4th floor, but something's not right here. The layout doesn't match the building plans, and we're seeing fire behavior that... Wait, I'm getting heat signatures that don't make sense. It's like there are rooms here that shouldn't exist. We're going to investigate further and... Command, I'm seeing people in period clothing like they're from a different time. I think we might have... The transmission cut off abruptly, and despite repeated attempts by Command to re-establish radio contact, Engine 18 never responded again. Lieutenant Rodriguez, Firefighter Walsh, and Firefighter Santos were found unconscious near the building's main stairwell 20 minutes later, rescued by the crew from Ladder 9. All three were suffering from severe smoke inhalation, but were otherwise unharmed. When they regained consciousness hours later at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, they had no memory of what had happened after entering the building or where Captain O'Sullivan had gone. The search for Mick continued throughout the night and into the following day, even as the warehouse fire burned out of control for nearly 8 hours before finally being extinguished. The building was a total loss, collapsing in sections as the old timber frame finally surrendered to the flames. Specialized rescue teams with thermal imaging equipment and search dogs went through every accessible part of the rubble, but no trace of Mick O'Sullivan was ever found. The investigation that followed was one of the most thorough in CFD history. Fire investigators, structural engineers, and specialists from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives all participated in trying to understand what had happened both to the building and to Captain O'Sullivan. The warehouse's ownership history was complex, with the building having changed hands multiple times and being involved in several insurance claims over the decades. But there was no evidence of arson, no indication of accelerants, and no obvious explanation for why the fire had behaved so unusually. Most puzzling to investigators was the testimony of Mick's crew members. While they had no conscious memory of what occurred after entering the building, all three described similar dreams and flashbacks in the weeks following the incident. They spoke of finding themselves in sections of the warehouse that seemed to be decorated and furnished as if it were still 1924, the year the building was constructed. They described encountering people in period clothing who seemed unaware that the building was on fire. Most disturbing of all, they all reported seeing Captain O'Sullivan walking away with a group of these mysteriously dressed individuals, as if he belonged with them. The warehouse fire became one of Chicago's unsolved mysteries, discussed in fire stations across the city, and analyzed in training sessions as an example of how quickly situations could deteriorate in older buildings. Mick's disappearance was officially classified as a line-of-duty death, and his name was added to the memorial wall at CFD headquarters. His family received the benefits due to a fallen firefighter, but they never stopped believing that somehow, somewhere, Mick was still alive. Katie O'Sullivan struggled to maintain normalcy for their children while dealing with her own grief and the constant uncertainty of not knowing what had really happened to her husband. Sean and Bridget both dealt with their father's disappearance differently. Sean threw himself into sports and academics, determined to honor his father's memory through achievement, while Bridget became fascinated with Chicago history and fire science, as if understanding the past might help her comprehend what had happened to Mick. Lieutenant Rodriguez was promoted to captain and assigned to Engine 18, where he instituted new safety protocols based on the lessons learned from the warehouse fire. Jimmy Walsh transferred to a different company, unable to work in the same firehouse where Mick's empty locker served as a daily reminder of his missing captain. Maria Santos remained with Engine 18, but began studying the psychological effects of trauma on firefighters, hoping to better understand what she and her colleagues had experienced. The warehouse site was cleared and remained vacant for several years, as insurance disputes and legal complications prevented redevelopment. Local residents reported strange phenomena in the area: unexplained lights in the empty lot, the sound of fire trucks and shouting that seemed to come from nowhere, and occasional sightings of figures in firefighter gear who vanished when approached. These reports were generally dismissed as urban legends or the psychological effects of the neighborhood's tragic history. The breakthrough that would finally provide answers came on January 17, 2024, exactly 10 years after Mick's disappearance. A construction crew working on a new housing development 3 blocks from the original warehouse site made an extraordinary discovery while excavating the basement of a building that was being demolished. In a section of the foundation that showed signs of severe fire damage, they found what appeared to be a firefighter's helmet, buried under layers of debris and sediment. The helmet was immediately recognizable as belonging to the Chicago Fire Department, but its condition was puzzling. While it showed clear signs of having been in a fire, it appeared to be much older than 10 years. The leather and metal components had aged in a way that suggested decades of exposure to the elements, and the helmet's design matched CFD equipment from the 1920s rather than the modern gear that Mick had been wearing when he disappeared. When CFD investigators examined the helmet more closely, they made an even more shocking discovery. Engraved inside the helmet in a style that matched the original manufacturer's markings was the name M. O'Sullivan and the number 18, Mick's company designation. But the helmet also bore a date, 1924, and the notation, Great Fire Memorial Service. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a historian specializing in Chicago Fire Department history, and coincidentally the daughter of firefighter Jimmy Walsh, was called in to authenticate the helmet and research its possible origins. What she discovered challenged everything historians thought they knew about the 1924 fire season in Chicago. According to her research, there had indeed been a massive warehouse fire on January 17, 1924, exactly 90 years before Mick's disappearance. The fire had occurred in the same block where the 2014 warehouse fire took place, and according to contemporary newspaper accounts, a firefighter named M. O'Sullivan had been reported missing in that blaze as well. The 1924 newspaper reports described the missing firefighter as Captain Michael O'Sullivan, of Engine Company 18, a 20-year veteran of the department who had vanished while leading a rescue operation in the burning warehouse. The physical description of the 1924 O'Sullivan matched Mick perfectly, down to his height, hair color, and the distinctive scar on his left hand that he had gotten as a child. Most remarkably, the 1924 newspaper included a photograph of the missing firefighter that looked exactly like Mick O'Sullivan, despite being taken 90 years before his birth. Dr. Walsh's research revealed that the 1924 warehouse fire had exhibited the same unusual burning patterns that had puzzled investigators in 2014. Contemporary fire officials had reported that the flames seemed to burn against all natural laws, and that the building's interior had been found to contain rooms and passages that didn't appear on any architectural plans. Most significantly, other firefighters who had been in the building during the 1924 incident reported encounters with individuals dressed in future clothing who seemed to be fighting the same fire using equipment that wouldn't be invented for decades. The discovery of the helmet prompted a full reopening of the investigation into Mick's disappearance, this time with a focus on the historical connections that were emerging. CFD historians working with Dr. Walsh discovered that the warehouse location had been the site of unusual fire incidents dating back to the 1870s, with reports every few decades of fires that behaved abnormally and firefighters who vanished under mysterious circumstances. The pattern that emerged suggested that the warehouse site might be what researchers began calling a temporal convergence point, a location where different time periods somehow overlapped or intersected. The theory, while scientifically improbable, was the only explanation that accounted for all the evidence. Mick O'Sullivan hadn't died in the 2014 fire, but had somehow been displaced to 1924, where he had lived out his life as a firefighter in that era. This theory gained support when investigators discovered that the basement where Mick's